Welcome everyone to Things Around 8. Dear friends, in this video we will talk about the flamethrower drones that have started to be used in Ukraine to try to end the stalemate of trench warfare. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any news. When the First World War began in Europe in July 1914, many believed that it would be just another European conflict, like so many others. And that, as had happened in the past, this conflict would be short-lived, and that by Christmas, everything would be over, and the men would be back with their families. However, by Christmas of that year, the situation on the front lines was in a terrible stalemate, with millions of soldiers literally bogged down in thousands of kilometers of trenches, dug by force across Europe, with the main reason for this being the innovation of new weapons that were rapidly emerging at the beginning of the 20th century. Before the First World War, the last major conflict in the world had been the American Civil War, a conflict that began in 1861 and lasted until 1865, leaving a toll of more than 600,000 dead and 500,000 wounded. But despite the scale of this conflict, with 3.5 million soldiers fighting on a continental territory, the tactics and weapons employed were not so different from those employed 100 years earlier. However, less than 50 years after the end of that conflict, when the First World War began, industrial and technological advances led to the birth of truly revolutionary weapons, notably the light and Portuguese consignments, and howitzers and artillery pieces with greater range and rate of fire, and most importantly, capable of firing explosive warheads. In the past, cannons acted more or less like large bowling balls, which were thrown at enemy lines in the hope of hitting as many soldiers as possible. But in the First World War, this changed radically, thanks to the advent of explosive warheads, which, as the name suggests, explode without impact, spreading a giant and very lethal cloud of fragments. They can also injure, or even kill, just with the impact of their shock wave. But despite the advances in technology and weapons, the strategy of military commanders was the same as in the 19th century, with this combination of old and obsolete tactics against automatic weapons of incredible lethality, resulting in extremely high casualty rates among soldiers. And so, with so many artillery shots and so many artillery stilettos crossing the battlefield, the soldiers were literally pushed to the bottom of unsanitary military trenches, beginning there, in mid-September 1914, the so-called Trench War, which generated a tremendous stalemate in the conflict, with either side managing to make great and convincing advances. For years, armies sought ways to break this impasse, with the first truly effective step in this direction having been taken in September 1916, with the appearance of the Armored Combat Vehicle, a British innovation that took the Germans completely by surprise, spreading panic throughout their lines. The British were unable to definitively break the impasse of the trenches due to the numerous mechanical problems faced by the armored vehicles. However, when they worked well, they were able to create small gaps in enemy trenches, which could be exploited by the infantry following close behind. In 1939, when the Second World War began, the dynamics of war were radically different, with the military prioritizing mobility on the battlefield through vehicles and armored vehicles, with much greater autonomy and mechanical reliability, allowing maneuvers of several miles per day, by units formed by large numbers or even hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Something unimaginable just 20 years earlier. And so, all this speed and agility greatly diminished the importance and relevance of trenches. And although they were obviously used in the Second World War, they played a more supporting role and almost always in a short-term perspective. After all, there was no point in spending time and effort on building large and complex trenches, when the enemy could simply go around and surround everything in quick maneuvers with their vehicles and armored vehicles. Because of this, throughout the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, trenches were proposed as complementary defensive methods, almost always inserted in a defensive, mobile, and dynamic strategy. This began to change in February 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Despite the highly mechanized and mobile assets of Russia and Ukraine, the truly mobile phase of the conflict ended in May 2022, just 3 months after the start of the war, with Russia no longer able to advance with the same speed and determination, initiating a slow war of attrition, marked by advances and retreats that were generally very discreet. a type of conflict in which trenches were once again used in full force, this being quite evident during the Ukrainian offensive launched in June 2023. As many remember, that offensive had as its main objective the Zaporizhzhia region. However, the delay in launching the attack, combined with the lack of Ukrainian air support, resulted in the failure of the operation, with the Ukrainians clashing head-on in hundreds of kilometers of Russian trenches. Of course, the use of trenches is not exclusive to the Russians and the Ukrainians, who are largely in a defensive position, using and abusing the trenches to block the Russian advance in some sectors. All these trenches contributed to the creation of a major stalemate at some points on the front line. And so, just as happened in the First World War, when the armies sought ways to break the stalemate of trench warfare, now the Russians and Ukrainians are seeking ways to do so as well, with the weapon of choice being the drone. Thanks to drones, the trenches are now being attacked from above, with small grenades spreading panic among the entrenched. This has led the armies to dig trenches in wooded areas, using the natural protection of the trees as an extra shield against drones. In these narrow stretches of trees between agricultural fields, small units of 100 to 200 soldiers, armed with machine guns, missiles and anti-tank RPGs, can remain entrenched and fighting for days or weeks. And it was with this in mind that the Ukrainians came up with the idea of flamethrower drones, large-scale equipment with a high payload capacity, armed with thermite, a pyrotechnic compound of powder and metal oxide, which when ignited generates an absurdly high amount of heat, in the order of 1,700 degrees Celsius, enough to cause fires, which if not immediately controlled, can lead to the detonation of ammunition stored there. There are several videos circulating on the internet showing drones dropping thermite on these groves. And although we do not yet have great details, it is clear that these are large drones. Probably octocopters with dozens of kilos of thermite, which is carefully dropped over areas where the ammunition for the troops entrenched there is believed to be. This is yet another deadly innovation in a war that, unfortunately, has no prospect of ending anytime soon. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any news.